It has been called the best-kept secret in American history. 50 years before the Pilgrim Fathers set foot on Plymouth Rock, Spain established the first European colony in North America. For 200 years, the community flourished. Then it collapsed, leaving no descendants, Spanish or Indian. Today, researchers are reconstructing this long-forgotten episode of America's past. I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we trace the dramatic rise and fall of Florida's lost empire. Next on Archaeology. On July the 21st each year, in St. Augustine, Florida, a group of enthusiastic amateurs gathers to recreate an historic event. Spanish militia meet British redcoats to decide the fate of Florida.
You are hereby commanded to give over to the English representatives the Castillo and the Presidio of St. Augustine and all possessions of Florida.
After a rule of 200 years, the Spanish had decided to quit. Their decision marked the end of a unique experiment. For Spanish Florida was like no other colony in North America. The story of La Florida begins on this beach, one fall day in 1565. A small party of Spaniards arrives to claim the land for Philip II. At the very start, Spain's imperial ambitions were clear. According to archaeologist Jerry Melanich from the Florida Museum of Natural History.
Pedro Menéndez de Avilés landed with what one contemporary observer called many banners, the sounds of trumpets, and the salutes of artillery. Philip II, the King of Spain, had granted license to Menéndez to establish what would be Spain's only colony in the eastern United States. He named the site St. Augustine, which would become the capital of Spanish Florida.
The birth of La Florida came as European superpowers were carving up the New World. Spain had a stranglehold on the Caribbean, from Cuba to Mexico. Britain and France were probing North America's eastern seaboard, as far north as Canada. This jockeying for power would remain a threat throughout La Florida's existence. In St. Augustine, the Spanish built Castillo San Marcos to safeguard their new possession. Yet it proved of little help in solving the young colony's greatest dilemma.
There were never more than a few hundred Spanish soldiers here at the garrison in St. Augustine, but out here in the countryside were more than 250,000 Indians. Even with firearms like this cannon, how could the Spanish ever hope to control such a population? The solution they came up with was ingenious, and it was a solution quite different from that the French would use in Canada, or the British or the Americans would use later on.
The foot soldiers of Spanish Florida were an unlikely crew. Men of peace, men of God, the friars of St. Francis. Their objectives were simple: to live among the Indians, to preach, and to make Christians out of savages. It proved a brilliant strategy. Within 100 years, missions swept north from St. Augustine through the territory of the Wale Indians to St. Catherine's Island, Georgia. A second chain of missions, each a day's walk apart, lined the Camino Real, the Royal Road. It led through Timucua territory to Appalachia, around present-day Tallahassee. Mission St. Louis, Appalachia's capital, was second in size only to St. Augustine. Today it is the scene of an extraordinary excavation and reconstruction project under the leadership of Bonnie McEwen.
One of the things we're a little concerned about is the size of the actual entrance to the council house. Now, all of
Under
the
discussion is reconstruction of an Indian ceremonial structure.
That you would actually have to stoop down to get into, and then you walk into this massive building that held between 2,000 and 3,000 people.
During 10 years of excavations, McEwen and her colleagues have mapped all the major features of Mission St. Louis.
And other events.
It was a very smoky, hot, smelly interior.
Right, which is why I think your plan of having this larger opening really makes more sense. Now, we know in areas to the north, like Wally, the council houses were enclosed completely, but down here where it's so warm in Florida, they tended to have a large skylight on them.
At the heart of the site is a large plaza surrounded by public buildings, including an unusually fine church.
It was a very large church, equal to the size of the one in St. Augustine, and measured 50 feet by 110 feet. Let me take you through the front door. Here you can see the charred remains of one of the major doorposts. It's made out of cypress, unlike any of the other buildings at the mission site, all the others of which were constructed of pine. The opposing door stop would have been in here, and it's a little more difficult to see, but I think you can see some of the charcoal flecks from it. Now, as you enter the church, it was traditional to have the baptistry on the left-hand side. And during the course of our excavations, just where we anticipated we would find it, we located the baptismal font. Now, the actual pedestal and basin have burned and crumbled, but if you look into the sidewall here, you can see the rubble from the baptismal font.
In most respects, the design of mission churches was completely traditional. But one feature caused unexpected problems for the Indians.
I'm standing in the nave, which was divided into 3 separate bays. Now, we know that the nave did not have any pews in it because there are accounts of Indians who, when they knelt down, actually tumbled over because they weren't used to balancing on their knees.
The trick in converting the Indians was to convert the chiefs first. The others would follow along. The Spanish left the chiefs' power and privilege intact, and the chiefs guaranteed their people's obedience. Yet this convenient arrangement did not always work perfectly. In 1597, at Mission Santa Catalina on the Georgia coast, the priests tried to stamp out polygamy, and the Indians staged a revolt. The Indians killed 2 friars and burned the mission. The insurrection quickly ended, and Mission Santa Catalina was later rebuilt. "50 years later, La Florida experienced a much more serious rebellion. The full story began to emerge only recently, when Jerry Milanich discovered 2 Spanish missions in places they should not have been. In a report written in 1675, Bishop Calderon of Cuba listed all the missions on the Camino Real between St. Louis and St. Augustine. Milanich's newfound missions were not among them.
Two things bothered me about the locations of those missions. First, neither of them fit with Bishop Calderon's 1675 account. And secondly, both were miles too far north of the Camino Real. They simply didn't fit with what we knew about mission locations.
At the sites, Melanich found fragments of the blue pottery, characteristic of the Spanish occupation. Dating them might reveal when the missions were abandoned.
When we analyzed the Spanish pottery from the two missions, we learned that all of it had been made by about 1650. We had known before that in 1656 there had been a rebellion among the Timucua Indians at the missions, and we wondered, could the abandonment of those missions in mid-century somehow have been tied to that rebellion?
In 1991, John Worth, then a graduate student under Melanich, discovered a cache of documents in an archive in Seville. Astonishingly, they were first-hand accounts of the rebellion. Following the rebellion, it turned out, Spanish authorities had held a residencia, a court of inquiry. Eyewitness testimony was taken from Spaniards and Indians alike. And everything was written down by the court reporter.
One of the more interesting and really exciting moments of going through the residencia was actually learning the name of Lucas Menéndez, the principal chief of the Timucua province who started the rebellion. We didn't know it before this time. And so when I suddenly came down and I said the name of this chief was Lucas Menéndez, it was one of those moments that I'll never forget.
The inquiry quickly focused on the behavior of Diego de Rebolledo, who had been governor when the insurrection occurred. Rebolledo was now dead, but the tribunal learned he had been the most corrupt governor in the history of Spanish Florida.
The governor, Rebolledo, actually at one point was melting down royal supplies such as nails, cannons, and guns, which were, of course, for military defense, and he would melt them down, turn them into axes and hoes, so that he could then trade with the Indians of the coast for amber.
The habit of melting down guns was soon to backfire. Throughout the Caribbean, the British were raiding Spanish colonies. In 1655, a year before the rebellion, they attacked and took Jamaica. Rumors spread that La Florida would be next. Rebolledo activated the Indian militia and ordered them to St. Augustine. Since he was short of food as well as guns, each man was to carry with him 75 pounds of corn.
And the key to the militia was that the chiefs were the leaders in the Indian militia. And the chiefs were used to not carrying anything. They were privileged people. They did no manual labor. They were warriors, but that was more of an honorary title, and they would fight, but they wouldn't do labor.
Offended, the chiefs rebelled. They attacked outlying missions, killing 3 Spanish soldiers and 4 laborers. Rebolledo responded with his usual deceitfulness. Calling the chiefs together under a flag of truce, he threw them in chains.
And the rebellion itself served as his justification for hanging all of the Aboriginal leaders, all of the Timucuan chiefs that started the rebellion. Their bodies were to be displayed either in their villages or along the main royal road as an example to the rest.
Rebolledo moved all the missions in Timucua, including the 2 that Jerry Melanich discovered, to the Camino Real, dramatically reorganizing the colony's economic base.
The mission Indians provided most of the labor for the colony. They worked the wheat farms, they worked the cattle ranches, they grew corn. But during the early 17th century, especially in Timucua, a series of epidemics had decimated the population. So Rebolledo decided to use the rebellion as an excuse to move the Timucuan missions down to the Camino Real and to put all his marbles in Appalachia. Appalachia would become the breadbasket of the colony, and the Timucuan missions simply were way stations along the road to it.
The new arrangement suited imperial Spain, but amongst ordinary Indians, the Spanish presence was taking a toll. On the 25th of May 1984, on St. Catherine's Island off the Georgia coast, an unprecedented ceremony took place. 3 Indian skeletons were reinterred by the Catholic Bishop of Savannah.
And on the day of judgment, raise them up to eternal life with all your saints.
There's no established ritual for this kind of thing because it occurs so rarely. But we have enough prayer forms and ceremonies for burials that we are able to adapt a ceremony.
This curious episode had its origins a decade earlier, when archaeologists began searching for a long-lost mission. With the help of some high-tech tools, Mission Santa Catalina was finally found in 1981. When the church was excavated, archaeologists discovered hundreds of Indian skeletons buried beneath its floor. In time, each would be respectfully reinterred. But first, the bones revealed a wealth of information about the lives of the Indians under the Spanish. At the University of North Carolina, bioanthropologist Clark Larson has studied the remains.
These are not Native American remains, but they illustrate, these anatomical specimens illustrate exactly some of these areas that we're looking at with Spanish mission populations. For example, in the skull, we see a series of perforations in the eye orbit that's caused directly by iron deficiency anemia. Many of these groups have a much higher frequency of iron deficiency that we think is related directly to an increased consumption of corn.
Even the remains of children recorded hardships of life in the missions. This tooth comes from a 9-year-old child.
We can plot precisely when the defect occurred as the tooth was developing. And here there's a line that at the top of the tooth that developed at about age 2, 2.5 from either malnutrition, or it may have arisen as a result of a disease such as an extreme fever like rheumatic fever. This is followed by yet another defect that occurred at about age 4 or 5. And so this individual has a whole series of stresses that resulted in literally stoppage of growth in the developing tooth.
Even heavy labor left its mark. Larson found increased osteoarthritis in mission Indians compared to skeletons from prehistoric times. Vertebrae from Indian spines show bone flanges and a loss of cartilage, both responses to heavy work. But while ordinary Indians suffered, their chiefs thrived. At San Luis, the center of chiefly power was the Great Council House. Bonnie McEwen's excavations reveal it to be one of the largest Indian buildings ever found in Florida.
I'm standing in the approximate center of the Appalachian Council House. It was an important building because it was where the Native Americans, and particularly the Appalachian chiefs, met every day to make decisions about planting schedules and any sort of disputes that they had with the Spaniards, as well as a number of other functions. You can see how large this building was based on the yellow tape surrounding the perimeter of the structure. It held between 2,000 and 3,000 people and was 110 feet in diameter. The opening to the council house faced on to the central plaza, and directly across from the council house was the Franciscan church. The plaza was 410 feet in diameter, and it's a very interesting study in the way the two cultures accommodated one another. They both had central plazas, and they both had either a council house or the Franciscan church on their central plazas in their traditional town plans.
At San Luis, the Spanish settlers prospered. From Spain, they brought a range of traditional crafts. Hunters and farmers traded with nearby Spanish colonies. Officially, all produce was to pass through St. Augustine, where taxes for King Philip II were levied. Here they illicitly shipped furs, cattle and wheat to Havana and kept all the profits for themselves. At San Luis, Spanish women were always in short supply. As a result, many Spanish men married Indians, usually the daughters of chiefs. Within a generation, a thriving class of mestizos, mixed bloods, had appeared. For 50 years, San Luis flourished. Most Spaniards lived better here than their counterparts in Spain. It was not to last. In 1670, the British had established a powerful colony in Charleston, South Carolina. Raids by the British and British-backed Indians became common along Florida's northern border. By 1700, they were developing into all-out war. To defend itself, San Luis built a fortified blockhouse, but to no avail. The tide of history had turned against Spanish Florida.
What you see in the profile here are the collapsed remains of the blockhouse, which was a large two-story building, and you can see all the remnants of charcoal as well as burned clay. This really marks the end of San Luis as a mission. The blockhouse was burned in 1704, just 2 days before the third British-led strike force reached San Luis. Most of the Spaniards moved into St. Augustine, a small number went on to Pensacola and Mobile, and the Indian population dispersed as well.
It was the same all over Florida. Missions shut down. People retreated to the shelter of St. Augustine.
In the end, La Florida fell victim to geopolitics. Conflicts and treaties between Great Britain, Spain, and France ultimately did the colony in. Here in St. Augustine in late 1762, word arrived that the colony was to be ceded to Great Britain. And then the next year, on July 21st, 1763, the transfer of power took place.
As Spain lowered its flag, all of St. Augustine looked on. Next day, the entire Spanish population left for Havana. With them went 63 Native Americans, the last of the hundreds of thousands of Indians who had once inhabited Florida. After 200 years, Spain's Florida Empire was gone. The Spanish experience in La Florida was a curious mixture of conflict and cooperation. Most Franciscan friars genuinely cared for what they called their Indian sons and daughters. At the same time, secular Spanish authorities and Indian chiefs wantonly exploited the native population. After Spain's departure, the British had little opportunity to celebrate. Following the American Revolution, the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 required Britain to hand back La Florida to Spain. But Spain was a declining power. On July the 10th, 1821, it finally relinquished its troublesome colony to the United States.